Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beat the Cult podcast. My name is Nikki, and I just want to thank you for dropping in today to have a discussion with me about religion and atheism and Christianity and all of the topics that we enjoy discussing. The whole purpose of this podcast is to combat harmful religious cult like thinking and practices. And today I am proud to announce that I am joined in this objective, no pun intended, by Objectively
Wow.
Dan.
Wow. Dang, you're slick, Nikki. You're slick.
See
You're
how I did?
that's a new one. I'll admit that's a new one. A lot of people do the objective thing, but you did it. So you did a good
Thank
job.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well,
Hmm.
welcome, Dan. I appreciate you dropping in and talking with me today. And I just want to just jump into a couple questions, get your perspective on atheism, kind of what got you into. I understand that you're with the Atheist Community of Austin. You've done the Atheist Experience and other call-in shows where you field questions from believers and also non-believers as well on the topic of religion and atheism and Christianity. So, with that being said, I just wanted to ask you kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of who you are, your background with religion, and how you got to this point.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be on the ground floor of the first, maybe not even first, we'll see how this goes, episode of your podcast. So a little bit about me for those who don't know me. I am Objectively Dan. I'm probably most known for being host and creator of a show called Truth Wanted, which is a product of the Atheist Community of Austin. I started it about 4 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. And it is a call-in show where I talk to people about what they believe and why. So it doesn't just exclusively talk about Christianity or atheism, although those are pretty common topics. Last week I was talking to a guy about aliens. I talked to people about Bigfoot. I've talked to people about all kinds of stuff because I do believe that the conversational tools that you can learn from having the conversations that we do can apply to a broad variety of topics, not just the kind of religion questions that we talk about. And that's pretty much my interest. I have a degree in communication studies, and that was kind of always a topic for me is how to actually talk to people about kind of complex and complicated ideas. So before I did the show, one of the first things I did in this space was I was doing some podcasting stuff with Anthony Magnabosco. If you're familiar with
Oh,
Anthony
Anthony's great.
Magnabosco,
Yeah.
yeah. Some people know this, some people don't. I was one of his victims in that I was a Christian when he talked to me on campus a couple of years ago. And and I actually recently learned he took that video down, but it was on there for a long time.
Oh,
And the,
wow.
and the reason why he took it down was because I complained to him one time. I was like, people always talk about this conversation, but they don't talk about what I'm doing now. And I think he felt bad about it. So
Oh,
I might convince him to put it back up there. But yeah, I was a Christian. I had a conversation with him for about 30 minutes. And later on, when I wasn't a Christian anymore, I got in contact with him and said, "Hey, I'm not a Christian anymore." So that's kind of cool, I guess. And then
yeah.
we started to get to know each other a bit more. And we kind of started on kind of a street epistemology podcasting project, which street
Excellent.
epistemology is the method of talking to people about complicated beliefs. And,
Mhm.
and we did that for a while. And at the same time, I was volunteering at the Atheist Community of Austin as a call-in screener.
Cool.
And while I was doing that, I kind of had this idea of, hey, what if we did the street epistemology stuff, but we did it on the call-in shows? That's basically what Truth Wanted turned into. So I'm lucky because most hosts aren't there from the ground floor. I got to be out there on the ground floor for a brand new project.
Right.
And I've been the sort of head of that for, like I said, the last 4 years. And of course, I make appearances on other shows too. I'm also officially a host of Talk Heathen. And I'm on AXP every once in a while. It's kind of whenever I feel like it or whatever. They're like, "Hey, Dan, can you cover us for this Sunday?" It's like, "Yeah, sure, I'll go on." So it's pretty fun. I really like doing it.
Very cool. So, I actually have a question about since you brought up Magnabosco and meeting
Hmm.
him, was
Yeah.
his interaction with you on the campus, did that kind of initiate your skepticism regarding religion?
So some people when they talk about my story, they describe it as like Anthony Magnabosco deconverted me, and I
Hmm.
wouldn't characterize it that way. I was already kind of having doubts. I kind of lied in the video. I said I was 100% sure, but there's a lot of pressure for me to kind of say that. For one, I was the leader of a college group at the time.
Oh, okay.
So like, I knew some of my friends would be watching and stuff like that. And, there's kind of a pressure in Christian communities to be on point with the whole faith thing, right? Like doubting is
Right.
a sin in some denominations.
Yeah, it is.
So,
Yeah.
you don't want to have that. So I didn't do that. But anyway, it was, I describe it as a stepping stone in sort of my total process. Cause really that took at least a year, if not longer, honestly, to really
Hmm.
fully deconstruct a lot of those ideas. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, what denomination were you raised in? What was your history with religion? Were your parents religious? Were they fundamental?
Yeah, my parents are pretty religious. I grew up the first 12 years of my life in a Methodist church.
Hmm.
And my teenage years, I started going to a Baptist church. Now, that wasn't for any
Hmm.
distinct theological reason. It was literally because the Boy Scout troop that I was going to went to this Baptist church. Like it was hosted at this Baptist church. So
Oh,
we just started going
okay.
there. And I was actively involved in the youth group. Again, I was part of a college ministry. So it was a pretty big deal to me. I would actually say I was even more religious than my parents to some degree, because I think
Oh,
I
okay.
attended more. I think I went to more church functions than they did, at
Oh,
least
okay.
as a teenager. Yeah. So,
Okay. So, what kind of made that, like, what made religion appealing to you at such a young age, even if your parents weren't as interested or involved as you were?
hmm. Well, I guess there's a couple different ways you can look at that. I think on some level it was psychological,
Hmm.
because if you believe that there's a God who explicitly controls your fate after you
Right.
die, you
Right.
have to kind of appease him a little bit. You know what I mean? I think that's what was
Absolutely.
kind of crazy to me when I was younger. It was like, why don't everybody like worship this guy because he's got all the cards? You know what I mean? He's the owner of the
Exactly.
house, and you want to
Right.
bet on the house, right? So
Right.
um, so that was kind of an approach. And like, it sounds so cynical to describe it in such frank terms, but I didn't realize this until after I deconstructed that a lot of my belief was a fear of hell. It was a fear of
Hmm.
consequences, right? Mortal consequences. So that was definitely part of it. The other thing was, I didn't know any other way of life. I grew up in
Hmm.
Waco, Texas, Nikki.
Isn't that where Baylor is?
That is where Baylor is, and it's also where David Koresh was unfortunately responsible for the deaths of dozens of people in the 90s.
Hmm.
Well, didn't actually happen in Waco. It actually happened outside of Waco. It's kind of a common misconception, but people associated with it, right? So
Of
anyway,
course.
it's a religious part of the world, and I didn't know anything outside of Christianity. I really didn't. It was kind of my only way of looking at things. Obviously, I've heard of other religions, I've heard of other ideas, but I didn't know how those
Yeah.
worked. And maybe more importantly, I didn't have a good method of figuring out what was true and what wasn't true. I didn't have a
Right.
good understanding of philosophy until at least high school and in college, when I started
Hmm.
reading stuff. I like to say I never had a formal training in philosophy, and that's somewhat true. I did learn about rhetoric and stuff and communication, right? Learn about fallacies, learn about writing good arguments. So there is stuff to it there, but everything I've learned pretty much about the hardcore stuff, I'm pretty much an autodidact in, right? Because like they don't teach you that in church for the most part, unless you got some special, church that you're going to that dives deep into that kind of stuff. But then you might not be a Christian anyway.
I was gonna say,
So
yeah.
I didn't have the tools to analyze my world. I didn't have the tools to compare. And so I was a Christian as a result. And I think that's the story of a lot of people, right?
Right.
They don't have the outlet. Yeah, that's another thing. I didn't have friends that weren't Christian pretty much. Everybody I
Hmm.
knew was Christian. So it's like everywhere that I'm interfacing is Christian to some degree. In
Right.
fact, probably the biggest influence on my atheism was the internet, because that was the only people I talked to for a while that weren't Christians.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that kind of leads into my next question about what kind of initiated the first bit of questioning
Yeah.
or skepticism that you had regarding your existing beliefs at the time.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has a unique kind of Christianity, right? We can
Right.
always paint broad strokes, but everybody's a little bit different. So, for example, I had no problems with evolution. I thought
Mm,
evolution made sense. Yeah, it's kind of scientific, whatever. But I did
right.
think humans were special. I did think
Mm,
maybe there was an Adam and Eve, or maybe it was just a story or a legend that informs us morally. Okay, so
right.
you kind of do these gymnastics to kind of figure this stuff out. I wasn't sure about the historical events of everything in the Bible, but I did definitely believe that there was a Jesus guy, and he definitely did some stuff, you know. So
Right.
it's kind of these give and take things. And as I was actually getting involved with the ministry, the college ministry, you know, you're pressured to preach to people, and that's what I did. I actually
Right.
went to other students on campus and talked about it.
Oh,
And you
wow.
want to, yeah, I know it was kind of weird talking to me now, but you
Yeah.
want to know what you're talking about, right? Like you want to be able to answer those tough questions. And so when I was trying
Right.
to answer those questions, I realized I didn't have good answers. And
Hmm.
when I found other people's answers, I realized I don't think those are good answers. So for a long
Right.
time, it was this internal dialogue I had with myself, this kind of internal battle. Then I started watching like atheist YouTubers and stuff, and that turned into reading atheist books. And then eventually,
Hmm.
you know, here I am today, a deadly sinner, you know, Satanist,
Hellbound. You're
hellbound.
hellbound.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, exactly. So, you know,
Okay. So what's interesting to me is that I believe that when people are religious, especially growing up in the church, they
mhm,
are pretty entrenched in their beliefs up
yeah,
to a certain point where they, I believe, naturally start questioning.
hmm.
However, most people become more entrenched as they continue to question. Why didn't you follow that typical pattern of becoming more entrenched in beliefs with, you know, inquiry?
That's a great question. I think that has a lot to do with my environment. So again, although I grew up in Waco, I did not go to college in Waco. I went to college
Oh,
in San Antonio, where you know
okay.
where I met Anthony and stuff. And so like,
Yeah.
and I'm also a kid of the of you know, I'm not technically Gen Z. I'm kind of in between Gen Z and millennial. I call myself a zillennial. Okay, but
Millennial.
for
That's funny.
for most of my life, I had access to the internet. Okay, so when you grow up with that, and then when you're on a college campus, when you're experiencing other people and different ideas, like that definitely challenged me in a way that I didn't have before when I was a really young kid, when I didn't have access to all those kinds of
Right.
tools and stuff. So I definitely consider myself a product of my environment for sure. I can see how if your only exposure to atheism or other worldviews is through the straw men that Christianity kind of portrays sometimes at the pulpit,
Exactly. Right.
then that might change your ways about thinking about other people, right? That might make you suspicious of their motivations. That might make you, in other words, not like them, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay. So since leaving, and how long ago, if you don't mind my asking, how long ago was it? I'm assuming further back than
Mm,
4 years, 5
uh,
years.
yeah. Well, what year was it when I first called myself an atheist? I think 2017.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. So it's been quite some time. Oh, okay. So about 5 years then.
around 2016, 2017 is when yeah it
Okay.
happened. Yeah.
Very cool.
Mm.
And after leaving Christianity and deconstructing from those beliefs, how did you start to restructure your perspectives on morality, death, and other big questions that Christianity purports to provide answers for?
It's a great question because I didn't go straight to atheism.
Mm,
I called myself a progressive Christian for a while. In fact, I
okay.
even used the term Christian mystic for a little bit.
Okay.
It sounds fancier than it is. All it really means is my evidence for God and pretty much my faith is centered around experiences rather
Mm,
than direct scripture and stuff. Because I kind of figured fairly early into the process, look, this whole Bible thing, it's kind of it's problematic. Okay,
a little bit.
it's not the best thing to use as your basis, but I still had these sort of spiritual experiences
Okay.
that I didn't know how to account for yet. So that
Right.
was kind of my basis. And through that, I thought that's how I understood morality. I thought that's how I understood
Mm,
God's love. Because again, this is the language. These are the tools that I've been given. I haven't yet found out about the centuries of secular philosophy that have been written about morality and stuff, right? I don't know who Nietzsche is yet. I don't know who Camus is yet, or any of the existentialists. Or I haven't figured that out yet. So I'm just working with the tools I got. And at the time, that was Christian progressive podcasts that were, making splashes because, they thought maybe gay people can be Christians. Ooh, scary. So that was like the stuff I was wrestling with. You know what I mean? Trying to figure out how to work my own morality, my own internal sense with the Christian stuff. And when I figured out these two kind of collided, I couldn't make it reconcile. And so that's when I kind of started to shift a bit.
Okay.
Right. So
interesting. So do you still have what you would quantify as a spiritual experience or similar experiences like you did have when you were Christian or progressive Christian? And if you do, how would you define them now or describe them?
Here's how I describe them now. What shifted me from that was a book by Sam Harris. Now, Sam Harris isn't, he's a little more, dubious today, right? Doesn't have the same reputation that he did a couple years ago. But at the time, he was popping off, and he was fairly popular in the atheist community. And that was his books really focus a lot about consciousness, and he talks a lot about human experiences. And when I'm kind of reading these atheist authors, I'm reading Sam Harris, and I realized these things that I call religious experiences are not unique to me at all, not unique to Christians at all, are in fact pretty universal. So there's two paths you can take with that. You can say, well, that means God is universal. Or you can say there is something about the biology of human beings that makes us have these experiences. And when you consider how drugs can affect your experiences, how mental illness can affect your experiences, there's a physiological component to this. The reason why I'm experiencing the things I'm experiencing is because I'm a human being with organic parts, right? That are interfacing with the world. That seems to make more sense than a God who is talking to maybe somebody who's suffering from schizophrenia and saying that they're talking to them, and then maybe talking to Aborigines and saying that they're giving them an entirely different story that isn't related to Jesus or anything else. That seemed to make less sense to me than just, human beings are evolved meat creatures that have design flaws that give us wrong ideas about the world, so.
Okay. And what about your views on morality? How would you define your stance on morality? Has it changed much since you were a Christian?
100%. I was, well, I don't know if this isn't directly, but kind of related to morality. I was definitely homophobic. I was definitely misogynist. I was definitely racist too, I would say. I can say that with, the confidence that I have now, because I have the analytical skills to kind of process that and judge my own experiences accordingly. But it's hard to do that again when you're kind of in this bubble and you don't have a sounding board to reflect off these ideas. So those things have all changed. And part of that is because of the way that I understand all those topics, like empirically, but also because of the way that I even consider morality. See, my basis was whatever the book says is right. There's people that can be good and happen to align with what the book says. But ultimately the standard is what the book says. And that's based on what God wants. Right. So when you don't have that, when God is suddenly a questionable concept, what do you base that on? I think that's a big struggle for a lot of people. And for me, I used a couple of different labels for a while. I think I would still call myself a secular humanist to a degree, but I prefer the term sentientist now. And a couple kind of a longer reasons for that may be outside of the scope of this show. But basically what it boils down to is that, secular humanism kind of talks about considering the interests of human beings, right? Which makes sense. Secular humanists don't use God or don't use religious interests. They use people's interests. Sentientism kind of expands those rights outside of human beings to talking about animal life to some degree, and hypothetically alien life and advanced AI. I don't think we're at a point right now where AI should have moral consideration.
Right.
But when that time comes, and I'm personally somebody that thinks that it will happen, then that I'm already kind of in the camp of we should consider the rights of that. So it's just kind of an
Okay.
expanded secular humanism in a way. But there's other literature that kind of talks about it that is interesting. So
That is extremely interesting. I've actually never heard of the term sentientist, I'm assuming.
yeah, I mean, I'm one of the only atheists that use it. I think
Oh,
I know one other, maybe one or two other people that in my circle that use it. But most are pretty comfortable with secular humanist.
okay.
You know, which is something I more or less agree with. I just kind of go a little bit one step further. So
Okay.
yeah.
And how did you first learn about this concept?
Well, that's an interesting story because when I do the show, I talk to people about their ideas and stuff, right? I'm challenged and I have to be able to present my thoughts coherently and cogently. When
Right.
the topic of veganism came up, I found
Okay,
myself,
yeah.
yeah, well, I found myself really struggling with this because we're hypocrites as a society, and we always have been. If I showed you and your family and friends a video of a man beating a dog and then cooking that dog and eating it afterwards, I'm assuming they wouldn't like that. There's most people in the United States aren't big fans of just senseless violence against dogs and cats too, animals that we typically associate with. But then when we
Sure.
think about the violence that happens with domesticated animals such as pigs, cows, even chickens, and when you look at the footage of that and you look at the stats on how these operations typically work, we tend
Right.
to not really think about that. We think of them, oh, well, they're just food animals, so that makes it kind of okay. But when we look at it from a consciousness perspective or a sentientist perspective, if consciousness is kind of too vague for you, if you want to talk
Mhm.
about just beings who have the capacity to suffer or to feel
Mm.
pain, a dog is
Mm.
not that much different from a cow. And
Sure.
that's not much different from a pig. In fact, there's things that a pig can do that dogs can even struggle with. I think that there's smarter pigs in some circumstances than there. I mean, you can teach a pig to use a computer, for example, a rudimentary computer,
Oh,
sure, but like
interesting.
you know, they are a mammal and they're evolved just like the rest of us, and they have capacities for suffering, just like we do. They, of course, not as complex as us. We have a very rich complex idea of suffering, but the base systems are still there. So thinking about that in mind, sorry, this is a tangent. I know this is probably
Oh,
what
no,
you
this is perfect. This is
were.
perfect.
With that consideration in mind, we have to, in my opinion, we have to expand our moral circle. We have to expand what that works with. And when the vegans really challenged me on this, I agreed with that. So in 2020, I became more dedicated to vegan principles. So
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
So this perspective doesn't just address the manner in which animals are killed for food. It also addresses eating animals overall, from your perspective.
In my perspective, yes. And the reason why is because when a lion eats a gazelle,
Right.
that is how nature tends to work. Okay.
Right.
That's how it has always worked. And human beings are part of nature. So we eat stuff too. So people are like, well, wait a minute. Aren't we a part of this system? Doesn't that mean
Yes.
that we're not as morally culpable? But we have a capacity to treat other people differently than we would before. I mean, this kind of system of, oh, well, they're just lower beings than us. We don't have to
Mm.
have their considerations. That's been the basis of misogyny. That's been the basis of racism. That's been the basis
Mhm.
of pretty much every horrific system you can think of. And
Mhm.
there is another system that we have to think about, which is carnism. And carnism is this idea that animals in the animal kingdom are somehow lower than us in some way and therefore don't deserve moral rights. Now, of course, a dog and a cat is not going to treat me the same way that you would or anybody else, right? Because it
Mm.
is cognitively different. But if I can avoid eating a dog, like I think you would agree, if I started a dog farm in my backyard and started eating them, you might question why, because I have like other things available to me, right, that aren't dogs. So
Sure.
I take that one step further and say, well, wait a minute, I don't have to eat hamburgers. I don't have to eat pork. There are, you can get a a variety of proteins and other kinds of nutritional supplementation from plant-based sources. And even if I don't eat, even if I eat just a few times a year, if it's meat, like that's still much better than doing that every day, even if I don't have to, you know.
Sure.
So it's a interesting thing to talk about. That again, I am the minority in this space so far. I don't think a lot of skeptics talk about it too much, but it is meaningful to me, because I do think if you think about it, it are the systems we currently have are kind of hypocritical and don't really make sense. And I try to, you know, even it out a little bit. I'm not perfect, surely. And there are arguments to be said that a lifestyle like that can be privileged. I think there's there's counter arguments to that, but you know, if I can make it work for myself, then I think I should do it. So that's why I do it, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to kind of follow up with that, what do you say to, just using the dogs and the cats as a specific example?
Yeah.
That is because it's in the case of the United States that we tend to have those as pets and tend to build emotional bonds with them.
Yep.
What about other countries where dogs maybe or cats may be eaten more frequently, or there's not as much of an emotional bond to those specific animals? How do you feel about them being consumed?
According to some sources, there's about 25 million dogs consumed each year. Most of that happens in Southeast Asia, right? And it's not, you shouldn't go to Asia and expect to be served dog at every restaurant you go to, right? It's in very specific cultures, very specific parts. So, you know, don't be racist about it, right? But it is a thing that happens. It's a thing that happens. And so you have to look at it clinically. The interesting thing is you can make the same case for India, which famously has a reverence for the cow that, you know, historically, right, most of the people there, whether they're Hindi or not, tend to have a cultural reverence for the cow. So there's a bit of cultural relativism at play, if you want to examine it from that lens. I think the aims of veganism and the aims of sentientism as well is to say, look, we don't have to use culture as our founding block, right? That's I mean, that's secular humanists would agree with that. We don't like culture being, oh, we you know, why do we not like gay people? Well, our culture says not to. Well, we don't agree with that. So in the same way, we don't use culture to say, well, this is our culture, this is how we've been eating things for a long time. You know, that way we should do it. Now, I'm not going into indigenous reservations and telling people, hey, don't do this. I'm mostly talking to, let's be real, other white people and other, you know, like people who are around me and trying to make that difference. Okay. Because again, it's the same thing where it's like, you're not going to talk about atheism to your friend whose grandma just died. Right. And says, oh, they're in heaven. Right. That's an awful thing to do. Yeah. Same thing here. Right. There's you know, yeah, you can be an absolutist about it, but those are the ones that get the viral hits on TikTok and everybody makes fun of them for it because it's not a polite thing to do. So, you know, you have to be able, I try to talk about it in pragmatic terms if I can. So, you know, hopefully that answers your question, I think.
It does. Yeah. To follow that up, what is your response to the argument that humans evolved as meat eaters, that we still, as though not as previously as pronounced, we still have fangs, that our digestive system evolved to be able to digest meat? How do you respond to kind of the vestiges of meat eating or meat eating behavior in human beings?
Oh, we did evolve to eat meat. We also evolved to eat plants. You know, we are omnivorous creatures, right? So for example, I had a cat who passed away earlier this year, unfortunately. With dogs, you can feed a vegan diet to. With cats, it's a little bit harder to do because cats require an amino acid called taurine. Taurine they can't produce naturally. It's something that they get exclusively from eating meat. So I fed my cat meat because that was their diet. I don't feel great about it, but pet food is usually a subsidiary of the regular animal agriculture industry. They're not killing cows, especially to get extra like pet food. That's kind of the extra product that comes from regular consumption. So I at least felt a bit better about that, but I wasn't going to take that away from them because he literally could not survive without meat. Now there's some people that say, oh, that I had a cat that I fed a vegan. The science is scant on that right now. Maybe in the future, if there's better ways to do that.
Okay.
And they
Oh.
can't. But animals, I mean, oh, sorry, humans, we know that they've been vegan because they've been doing it for thousands of years. I mean, look at, if you want to look at examples of this, look at basically the entire subcontinent of India, who has had
Hmm.
a huge culture of vegetarianism and in some cases veganism
Hmm.
that spans back thousands of years. And by the way, this also relates to the privilege argument, because there's the poorest people in the world are eating vegetables most of the time.
Hmm.
Meat is a luxury in most places. America has it so cheap because of the subsidies we have and
Yeah.
because of the culture we have. But meat is a luxury in a lot of places of the world that isn't a daily diet for a lot of people. There's studies that show this, that people in poverty tend to mostly get their this is culturally context sensitive, excuse me. But for a lot of people, like, plants are how they subsist. So it's not unprecedented to be a vegan, right? It's not completely
Okay.
new. So
Okay. So with that being said, of course, changing that,
yeah,
the perspective, going back to the cultural references,
yeah,
to the variances between diets in India, South East Asia, America,
yeah,
and other places. How So it's going to be hard, of course, to move people to veganism.
yep.
I'm very, very guilty of craving steak and
No guilt.
um,
I don't believe
liking.
in guilting people in that way, but yes,
Well, thank you.
there are some people that do that, and they hear me and they say, "Oh, well, I feel guilty because I do this." Don't. I ate meat for most of my life, and most vegans have too. It's a realization that you have with yourself, But anyway, continue, please. I
Well,
interrupted you.
no, don't apologize.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, I don't feel guilty for eating meat.
Mhm.
Within the context of this conversation, I will
Yeah.
admit some guilt because I understand your arguments, and I am not in a position to counter argue veganism at all.
Sure.
I'm not well versed in the science or even the
Mhm.
history of vegan arguments. But with that being said, for example, someone like myself or an American who grew up in a culture that is centered around meat eating.
Yeah.
Our holidays are promoted based on the type of meat you're going to eat that day:
Yep.
ham, ribs, like on the
Mhm.
4th of July, turkey. Would you say that perhaps if America moved from the factory farming method to more of a humane farming method, that would start to resolve
Mm.
the issue?
Let's talk about that. What does the word humane mean in this context?
I'm not sure. That's a
Mm.
good question because I was watching, and I guess because I asked the question, I should have an idea of what this means. And I think that's a very good point because I don't know what Dillahunty and vegan gains.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
I When I found out that they had a conversation, my mind was blown. I was like, it's Christmas for me. I cannot believe these two had a conversation. And I watched their video and I found it very interesting. And for once,
Mhm.
Vegan Gains was actually calm and within his, being calm. Of course, Matt was not, but that's his want. And that's why I like Matt. But you know him personally. But
Mhm.
I've only met him once. But I started looking some things up to get back on track with that
Yeah.
question. And I fell into a video with a woman who was killing chickens humanely. And she had like sedated them and like put them in kind of like a funnel type contraption upside down and then cut their throats and let them bleed out. And she was she wasn't malicious. She was like, okay, here's how you do it. And here's how to survive in the event that society goes to hell. And it was very
Mhm.
informative.
Mhm.
And people were in the comments saying, oh, this is humane. Of course, I'm sure they probably deleted consent, people who did not agree, but or
Yeah.
dissenting comments. But maybe I would say, with that being said, something quick. Um, I don't know what that means, of course, depending on
Sure.
the animal,
Well,
sedating the animal to where they don't
well,
feel that
it's
pain.
funny because we don't sedate animals
Right,
for the most part, right?
right, right,
It doesn't happen in the vast majority of the industries that happen
right.
because it would be too cost prohibitive.
Yes, I can
So
understand that. Yeah.
and this idea that we can continue our current trends of eating the same food that we do and just euthanize them is just not realistic for the output of human beings that currently eat meat, right?
Sure.
But let's beside that point, right? Even talk about this. What do we mean when we say we want to kill another human humanely? We typically
Hmm.
mean we don't actually kill them. We typically actually mean they want to end their own lives. Most atheists are fans of ending their own lives with euthanasia with the assistance of medical professionals
Sure.
when for example there's a terminal illness that occurs
Sure.
or other kinds of things. I mean, this kind of we're generally in the atheist community, we're pretty okay with that.
Sure.
We wouldn't even be able to offer that to animals because they are
Right.
not going to be the ones that say that they want to end their lives. We are the
Right.
ones that want to end their lives.
Sure.
So in my perspective, that's not humane. And there's no way where I can say, Nikki or anybody else, well, I know that that person didn't want to end their lives, but I wanted to end their lives for my benefit. And I killed them using euthanasia, even though that wasn't what they wanted. But I think that makes me humane. You would never agree with that, right? You would say, no, you took that person's life
Sure.
without their consent. They didn't want that. So this idea even of saying that we can humanely kill animals is a little bit absurd. Now, of course, if you see a sick deer, that's suffering from rabies or something, yeah, okay, that's different because that is an uncaused suffering from human, not related to human beings. But
Hmm.
when we have them at farms, that's directly related to human beings because
Sure.
we're
Sure.
the ones putting them in that situation. You know what I mean? So
Sure.
that's kind of my take on this. On when people ask, well, what about humane ways to do it? To me, it's almost absurd. It almost doesn't make sense, right?
And that's kind of what I was thinking about that. And as I
Mm,
watched the video, I was thinking, well, humane, quote unquote. It didn't.
yeah,
And I don't, how would I define that? That's a good question. It didn't feel, I don't know how I would define it, but I wouldn't define it. I know I wouldn't use the example I saw to define it. So I had some questions about, is this really do humane?
yeah.
But because I don't have a very strong foundation on which to stand regarding the definition, I wasn't really sure if there was something I was missing regarding standard farming practices that have been
Mhm.
accepted, or there was some type of esoteric knowledge that I was lacking to adequately define the word
Mm,
humane.
hmm.
But your argument, it does make a lot of sense, and it does align with kind of the discomfort I felt in defining that particular method as humane.
Yeah,
Um, but I still say I have a lot of ignorance in that
it's
area.
well, I did too. I took about, I'd say 6 months from the start of me really seriously thinking about it to
Hmm.
me being like, okay, well, this is what I really want to do. At least that long, maybe even longer. I read books, I watched documentaries, I had conversations, kind of similar to my atheism, where it's like, oh, I feel like I'm kind of alone in this thing, and
Right.
I don't
Especially in
really,
America. Yeah.
yeah, especially in America. And every time I bring it up, I feel like I get made fun of more being a vegan than I do as an atheist. I'll be honest. I think
Of course.
the culture isn't ready for that conversation, to be quite frank with you. I think it usually
Right.
boils down to memes, usually boils down to mean-spiritedness, attacks on character and stuff, where I'd like to try to approach it as analytically as possible and say, look, here's the philosophical arguments for it. Here's the actual, and this is interdisciplinary, right? Because we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about
Mhm.
modern agriculture,
Right.
we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about human evolution. I mean, that's a whole bunch of stuff. Just like with the atheism thing, where it can combine a bunch of things. The veganism
Right.
thing is the same thing. It can combine a bunch of different fields, and unless you really looked at it, you might not be confident one way or another.
Right.
So I kind of had to figure that out for myself,
Right.
and that's where I'm at now. So
And it is intimidating to evaluate that perspective and give it the honor it's due by examining all of the multifaceted perspectives and
yeah,
areas of study necessary to form a well-informed belief,
yeah,
basically, or understanding. And it kind of like religion and meat eating is directly, I guess I would say, connected to religious beliefs and practices, especially in Judaism.
100%.
Um, right.
Mhm.
And Christians, I'm not really
Most
necessarily sure how
sorry, I don't mean to
intertwined
interrupt you.
it is there, but
I just
yeah, I'll continue.
I got
Yeah.
excited because this is a great point. most world religions have something to say about food.
Yeah.
Christianity is actually the one unique exception to that, and that's not always been the case either. Because if you look at the early Christian texts, they talk about, oh well, can we eat this temple meat and stuff like that? Can we do this stuff that's not clean, right? Like there is a cleanliness associated to it, but there's these cultural constructs around food that, again, most world religions have talked about, which is fascinating. But anyway, I got excited about it, so continue,
No,
please.
it is fascinating. And I appreciate your passion on this subject because
Yeah,
it makes it exciting for me as well. Because I've never really discussed it. I've always seen perspectives. I see people going back and forth. I usually don't address it on my page because I don't necessarily know how everyone feels about it. I don't
sure.
necessarily have, all I know is I like meat. I was raised on meat. Every meal I eat centers on meat.
Yeah,
It's very difficult for me not to eat meat for every meal. And
yeah,
also when I don't, it feels weird. Even though my mom, bless her heart, and I'm from the South, so I'm
yeah.
going to say that. She tried sometimes to have a meatless meal like once a week, but my father wasn't going for it. He's like, I want meat of some sort.
Sure.
Um, so I do love meat. A lot, I
Hmm.
have to say it. And that goes to the preference argument that it's mostly for taste and not really necessary.
Hmm.
But I don't know if that's true
Well,
or not.
let's think. I mean, let's think about it from this perspective too. I mean, global warming, climate change is
Sure.
something I assume you believe in. Um, I
As far as I understand, the evidence
Okay,
demonstrates that the world is heating
okay,
more and
great.
more. Yeah.
So I think there's a conversation of, well, who's responsible for this? How can we be responsible? There's
Yes.
people that say you should take public transportation. There's people you should say, oh, you need to recycle. The
Yeah.
cause and effects of that, sometimes are dubious, but at the same time, there is a consistency there somewhat where it's like, okay, yeah, given between two equal options, whether to carpool or take my own car, and there's no other affecting factors, which isn't in the real world because we all have other affecting factors. I think most people
Right.
would agree, okay, yeah, you carpool, right? That seems to make the most sense. I mean, you can make a parallel with veganism in that, you don't have to cut cold turkey right away if you think that these arguments are morally compelling. It's just
Mm,
being one, starting with a consciousness, being more aware,
mhm.
and making that slow transition. I couldn't cut cold turkey. I tried to do it and I couldn't. I had to ease my way into it, and that also didn't include just the consumption of food. It was also just animal products in general, in
I
trying
was
to
gonna ask
avoid.
you about
Yeah.
that, how you felt about milk, cheese, or even, clothing or I mean, because it seems like animal products are used in a lot of things that we use daily that we
They're
don't know
certainly
about.
using a lot, and I'm not going to pretend here and say, oh yeah, I never consume animal products ever, because I do, but I
Sure,
try to minimize that impact as much as I can,
sure.
and also understand the sourcing on that. Like the general advice I think from a lot of people is, if you're interested, okay, see if you can just cut out milk, or see if you can just cut out dairy, and just see,
I don't
and
cheese, milk,
you gotta start somewhere,
cheese, well, that's a fight.
Yeah,
Cheese is a
I
fight.
get you. I get you. And you know, um, like it's always going to be something that people can improve themselves on and work better on. But I go back to this: if I can do it, should I do it? And I feel like
Mm,
I can do it, so I should do it. And that's what it is for me at the end of the day. Even if I can't see the direct impact that I'm having, I know that it's the right thing to do, and that's just, I can't get around that.
I understand.
Yeah,
So, what do you feel about fish? Well, you said animal products in general, but
yeah,
for those who maybe and this kind of goes back to the sentience
yeah.
argument
Hmm.
because with mammals being mammals ourselves, we can definitely relate to them more in their
Hmm.
potential expression of emotion, pain, and suffering. But
Yeah.
for a fish or for a shrimp or a
Hmm.
crab,
Hmm.
how do you feel about that?
Well, you'd be surprised about the consensus amongst the scientific community when it comes to, especially in animals like crabs and lobsters. There's a lot more
Mm,
people There's a in 2019 or 2020, statement was signed on affirming that lobsters do in fact feel pain. In 2012, Cambridge University has a signed statement of consciousness talking about animals in general.
Hmm.
But like, you know, when you really look at the facts of what we previously thought was pretty common knowledge was like, oh, these animals can't really feel pain. That may have been based on some rudimentary understandings of biology. It seems that pain is a pretty good driving force for telling an animal to either do something or not do something, or to avoid something and keeping
Sure.
them alive. It seems to exist outside of mammals. It seems to exist in other, you know, you can call it more basic animals if you like. But it seems to be there. The systems that interface with those animals is quite similar to what we have here. Now, I'm not going to be able to
Sure.
tell you, oh, this is how this species is different from this species, right? I'm not a biologist, but it's more the evidence for these other animals having pain concepts is more common than you might think. I'll leave it at that. And I can maybe show you some resources after the show that would, provide support for that.
I don't doubt that other animals feel pain.
Yeah,
Obviously, they respond to unpleasant stimuli by moving
yeah,
away from it.
sure.
If you put flames close to them or something, I mean, they're going to feel that pain.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking more along the lines of cognitive ability,
Mm-hmm.
and the ability to reason, or I guess win the heart. And I there are people who have reptiles for pets, and ant farms and like them, but when you look in the eyes of your cat or your dog or something like that, or a cow, um, that forms kind of an emotional connection.
Mm-hmm.
And in the event, not that you can't look at a fish or fall in love, whatever, the people are weird. There was this, well, a dolphin is a mammal, so that's not a good example about this
Yeah.
weird guy who was dating a dolphin. People are weird. But I guess what I'm saying is, um, for animals that aren't as cognitively advanced as a
Mm-hmm.
mammal,
Mm-hmm.
when I hear the term sentience, well, how do you define sentience? I guess I should
Well,
start with that.
before I answer that, let me tell you a quote that I really really like. It's by a philosopher you may have heard of him by the name of Jeremy Bentham, and
Hmm.
he says, "Ask not if they can think or if they can talk, but if they can suffer." And
Sure. Oh
this
yeah.
is his argument here. It's basically saying, well, look, I mean, if you really think about it, you ever seen a 1-year-old kid? You ever seen a 6-month-old kid? Has absolutely no capacity to reason whatsoever. I mean, there's gorillas that are more cognitively capable
Sure.
than infants in our own species. And yet we
Yes.
don't use that to say, well, I guess it's okay if we cook up an infant today because it can't actually think or it can't actually reason.
Well, that's a
Um,
human being as well, and that's
sure.
contradictory to the concept that we need to persist as a species, and we're going to have
That's
empathy for
that's
a
true.
human baby.
Let's talk about a gorilla then. I mean, we can say the same thing with an animal that's very close to us, right? I mean, in lineage, more so
Sure.
than most other animals. I think most people would be opposed to cooking a gorilla alive,
I think
despite that,
that
right?
might well, I think that may have to do more so with our culture as well. I'm not sure necessarily who, and also too,
Hmm.
gorillas, I believe, and if I'm not mistaken, are endangered creatures,
I think
and
most of them
not
are.
yes, and not
Mhm.
typically used for food.
Yeah.
I'm more talking about animals that are used for food, like
Hmm.
fish, shrimp, cows, chickens, ducks, lambs, goats,
Hmm.
things like that. Not
Hmm.
necessarily a primate or a human, because the Aztecs, they didn't last for that reason, eating
Hmm.
everybody. But I'm mostly speaking about animals that are farmed for food, or typically used for nutrition, not
Yeah.
apes or humans.
Well, you ask, should they be in? If I understand your question, should these animals have moral consideration? Uh,
Yes, that's
yeah,
more my question.
yeah.
Yeah.
And my answer would be yes, And again, and the reason why I point out the human baby example is because of the standards by which we give, right? In other words, I don't think the standard should be, well, in this culture, it's so these people use this animal for food, so therefore we should respect that. I think it goes back to this sort of relativism thing where, again, my standard for moral consideration has nothing to do with culture. It more so has to do with the ability to suffer, right? That's primarily what I mean when I'm talking about sentience,
Okay.
is a
Okay.
capacity to suffer.
Okay.
Which again, I would say that, there may be grown, well, let's use an example. I mean, like cows are very commonly used in our culture and other cultures for food. A grown
Yes.
cow is smarter in pretty much every noticeable respect than a 6-month old. But we seem to have that distance there, one, again, because it's a species of our own, but because we don't use philosophical treaties to base our examinations on what's okay to eat and what's not. We basically use culture as our quick index,
Sure.
for a lot of it, and availability as well, convenience, because you can buy a burger at any corner in America. I mean, it's constantly there. So I think that influence affects our ability to think about these issues more than we realize, and affects our sort of outlook more than we realize as well.
Oh, absolutely, it
Yeah.
does. How do you so excuse me, along those lines,
Yeah.
being that this is kind of a more recent decision, basically
Hmm.
within the past few years, how has your celebration of holidays changed?
Mm.
Do you still go home?
Hmm.
Does your mother cook, your aunt cook, or your girlfriend?
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
Well, my girlfriend tries to eat at least one vegan meal a day, which is great.
That's awesome.
My mother thinks I'm crazy and doesn't do anything to change her views. I
Your
We went
family's
home the
from
last.
Texas, right?
They're from Texas, like
Yeah.
they think that I'm, you know, I was telling her over the summer how I got sunburned, and she was like, "Oh, do you not believe in sunscreen anymore?" I was like, "Oh, no, I did. I didn't put enough on." So, you know,
Oh,
um,
goodness.
but yeah, like there is that kind of tension there, and then that's another reason why, again, you mentioned you didn't want to post it in your page. One, because you said um, it's just not a topic that you generally explore on your page, which most people don't, right? But also because you have an opinion on this, and it starts to turn heads, that people will start that judgment on you. And that's why, again, I feel like I've gotten more hate from talking about this subject than the atheism stuff, because it brings up people's moral culpability, and people are very uncomfortable with that people don't want to think that
Sure.
they're bad people. And I don't think people who eat meat are bad people. I don't think
Sure.
that's too black and white. It's just more
Yes.
so that I've had the privilege, again, to think about and deconstruct and analyze the culture in which I live in versus my principles and philosophical ideals. And this is the conclusion I've come to. It's nothing more than the conclusion of an analytical exercise for me.
Very cool.
So yeah.
Okay. So do you just kind of stick with the cranberry sauce and
Oh
like
yeah.
green
So well,
beans?
so I'm okay. So there's different kinds of vegans, just like there's different kinds of atheists. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, I'm what I would call a philosophical vegan, which means I really care about animal suffering,
Mm,
but I also know that human beings have a capacity to eat meat, and I still like the taste of meat. So,
sure.
in general, as long as I'm not purchasing meat, in other words, I'm not directly culpable for continuing those industries, then I will eat meat. If we're at a party and someone has some pizza and say, "Hey, I'm about to throw this away. Does anybody want this?" I will eat that pizza, because at
Sure.
that point it's already been purchased and paid for. I wasn't necessarily the intended audience because it was made for other people at that party and not me, because I wouldn't ask for that pizza, but it's still there. And to me, you either waste that pizza and have it go fill up a dumpster somewhere, or
Right.
I can consume it and have it nourish my body for whatever pizza's worth,
Mhm.
and do that. So that's fine. So with holidays, again, my mother's not going to change on that. So I'll eat the turkey while I'm there.
Okay.
Some vegans, they don't like that. They're like, "Oh, we should be absolute in every situation." And I guess, but not everyone in the world's going to be vegan tomorrow. So I don't go to everyone with that expectation.
Okay. So a philosophical vegan, is that, wow, that's so interesting. I've never heard of that differentiation. I assumed that vegan meant no meat eating, period, no consumption of animal products, period, at any time.
Yeah, I mean, like there's different labels. All these labels are man-made, right? Vegan's kind of a man-made word. So I tend to go with the Vegan Society's definition of vegan, which is, in short, to minimize the amount of animal products used in your life, basically. And so
Oh,
minimize doesn't mean you have to
eliminate.
never use it ever again. It just means you have to figure out when it's reasonable and when it's not.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm going to think it's more reasonable to not than some other people are. Some people may justify it to themselves, but my guiding
Sure.
principle there is, if I can do it, then I should. So that's kind of how I roll.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's an allowance for the cultural entrenchment. There's an allowance for familiarity, the
Mm-hmm.
inability of someone to kind of deviate from long held beliefs and automatically drop those. There's some permission there because a
Well,
lot of
yeah.
vegans, unfortunately, and it's almost kind of like the squeaky wheel gets the attention.
Mm-hmm.
That the louder, more disrespectful ones are who represents the group, unfortunately. So the variation in these perspectives isn't always presented.
But when
Um,
is that not true? I mean, isn't that true for the atheist community? Isn't it true
sure,
that the biggest assholes in our community sometimes have the loudest? Isn't it true for the feminist community that the straw man is always a loud woman that
different colored
speaks her
hair,
mind, different colored hair, right? So it's the exact same thing with the
who's
vegan.
unattractive to men, and that's why she
Unattractive to
becomes
men, yeah, 100%.
right,
So is it, the gay community? It's the person who's the most queer coded, right? Who
right,
has the most deviances from what's normal. Exact same thing happens with the vegan community. Yeah, there's going to be assholes. That doesn't change the principles. And the same way that, look, every single atheist in our community could be assholes tomorrow. That doesn't mean that God's real, you know.
exactly, right.
So just
Just from
because
that
there's,
perspective, people
yeah.
need to, it's, I guess I made that point to kind of highlight my
Mhm.
own ignorance on the topic.
Mhm.
I did not know that there were, I'm assumed as I learned more that there would be nuances, but I was not previously aware of this nuance.
There's quite a bit of variance. There's quite a bit of discussion on what makes someone vegan and what makes it, when it is reasonable to consume animal products. I mean, I'll tell you this. I live in an apartment complex that's taken up land that an animal could be used for habitat. I do
Sure.
take a car to places. I'm bound to hit mosquitoes. God forbid I hit other kinds of animals, right? So like I take up space in the world. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that conversation of then what's reasonable or what's not. I mean, that's philosophy, baby. That's just ethics in a nutshell. We're never going to have absolute answers,
Right.
but that doesn't mean I can't always tell when I can do something and when I can't, when I can be complicit in an act and when I can't. Right. So
Very cool.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we're gonna wrap up here in a bit. This
Mhm.
conversation has been amazing. It went a completely different direction than I thought it would, and that is the beauty of these conversations. So I want to thank you for coming on my inaugural podcast and giving me the opportunity to, kind of get my feet wet and move into this space, which I'm hoping to do more prominently down the road. So if you don't mind, just kind of give us your social media, kind of a
Mhm.
rundown of where we can find you.
Right. So I'm on Twitter at Objectively Dan. We'll see how much longer I can stand being on Twitter, but that's where I'm at right now. Um,
Same.
and yeah, and of course, the project I'm primarily featured on right now is Truth Wanted, which is live every week, Fridays at 7 p.m. Central on YouTube. But you can also listen to it on iTunes or
Oh, cool.
Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. I know iTunes isn't really a thing anymore; it's Apple Music, but I'm so used to saying that I still do it anyway.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dan. And of course, I want to say a thank you to the viewers. You can find the Beat the Cult podcast on Beat the Cult at YouTube. You can also find me on Twitter at Beat the Cult, as well as Instagram and TikTok under the same handle. So with that being said, I just want to thank everybody for dropping in and watching us today. Please stay tuned for additional podcasts down the road, and I will see you then.